Ride safety regulations are hardly the most interesting topic out there, but despite this, they're actually quite a bit more complex than you might expect. The regulations used by the amusement industry were created not by lawmakers, but instead by the industry itself all around the world and over the span of several decades. Accordingly, a lot has changed even in just the last few years, and what regulation applies changes based on where you are in the world. Today, we will complete an overview of what regulations apply where and how these regulations were developed. Starting things off with the area already most covered on this channel, that being the US. In the US, there are no federally mandated regulations on amusement rides, meaning that these are left to individual states. This is actually quite common for the industry around the world. Inside the US, the ASTM F24 committee meets twice yearly to develop and amend ride safety standards. A few of their most important for the industry are F770, Standard Practice for Ownership, Operation, Maintenance, and Inspection of Amusement Rides and Devices, F2291, Standard Practice for Design of Amusement Rides and Devices, and F1193, Standard Practice for Quality, Manufacture, and Construction of Amusement Rides and Devices. These standards are written by those inside of the industry from all different backgrounds, who attend voluntary meetings to propose and vote on changes or to develop new standards. To learn more about the content of these standards or about ASTM in general, check out these videos I made in the past. These standards are completely voluntary for the industry, but many US states have chosen to make compliance with the standards mandatory. Confusingly, this varies largely from state to state, with some requiring compliance with only a few of the standards, compliance with only part of a standard, or to add even more confusion, compliance with an outdated standard. These standards are required by ASTM to be amended every few years, and the standards are renamed accordingly. For example, the current version of F770, the most basic amusement ride standard, is F770-22, meaning it was last amended in 2022. This is a far more frequent cadence of updates than most state laws get. Accordingly, some states use versions of the standard that are as old as 1993, such as Texas and California. The good news for operators is that compliance with a newer standard will not bring a ride out of compliance with an old one, but this method of regulation does cause some unneeded confusion. Some states simply require compliance with the standard itself and do not mention a version. As a reminder, this is just one standard of the over 20 F24 committee maintained standards. Some states do not require any compliance with these standards at all as well. That being said, it's generally considered to be in an operator's best interest to be compliant with the standards, as if an accident were to occur, the park would have a much stronger defense if they can prove that they were compliant with industry standards. ASTM standards are developed in the US, but they are intended for international adoption. Canada adopted a version of ASTM standards in 2014. These are enforced at a federal level around the country and therefore apply everywhere. Unfortunately, nothing with ride standards is simple, and Canada had their own existing standards made by the Canadian Standards Association, or CSA. They did not want to completely drop these standards and move to ASTM. Accordingly, they worked with ASTM to develop ASTM F2783. A combination of core ASTM standards along with some remaining aspects of the previous CSA standard. Other countries, such as Chile, have adopted all or some of the ASTM standards and enforced them at a federal level. Outside of the Americas, ASTM standards are less common, but they do still have some presence, especially when combined with other standards. In Europe, EN standards are the most popular. These standards are made in a similar way to ASTM and actually share a lot of content. In fact, in general, a large amount of harmonization has been made by standard writing organizations. This helps to ensure that if a particular standard is in place in one region due to political reasons, the rides from that region will generally be compliant with the standards of other regions. This is not always the case, but it is an active effort. This is most true for the ASTM and EN standards, which were started independently from each other, but now share a large amount of content between them. EN has 3 large standards for amusement rides. These are EN 13814-1 through 3. Much like ASTM, these standards cover a wide range of topics in the industry, and are updated frequently by those who work in the industry. Just like in the US, EN standards are not required by a large government body, and it instead comes down to individual countries and sometimes regions within those countries to enforce compliance. France, for example, did not require compliance with these standards until 2008. However, they have an exception built into their laws to allow for rides that comply with other similar standards from European countries to automatically be compliant in France. This can lead to loopholes with rides coming from Eastern Europe that would not be compliant with EN being allowed to operate in France. EN standards are also not retroactive, meaning exceptions are made for attractions built before the standards were in place. ASTM has a similar provision. In Europe, the TÜV is commonly used as an inspection body for amusement rides, even being required by some areas. The TÜV is a non-government organization that consists of a number of companies dedicated to inspection and certification of various products. Some of these focus on amusement rides and independently inspect and certify rides, somewhat like third-party ride inspectors in the US, except these inspectors can issue certifications of legal value that guarantee a ride is built, maintained, and operated in accordance with the standards in place. As a part of their inspections, TÜV ensure a ride's compliance with EN standards. TÜV certifications are required for rides that operate in parts of Germany and in a few other European countries. Even in areas where their independent certification is not required, it's still generally considered to be in an owner-operator's best interest to use them. Outside Europe, there are a few more standards to be aware of. ISO was originally intended to be a global standards organization. However, their amusement ride standards have mostly been developed in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Their standards are written in a similar fashion to ASTM and EN, but have recently been impacted by conflict in this region, resulting in the standards falling behind. Their core standard is ISO 17842-1-3. Many aspects of ISO mirror EN, but again, it's generally considered to be inferior to the other two. ISO is very broadly applied thanks to ISO's global nature. Many areas that do not want the political pressure of accepting a US or European standard opt for ISO. This has led to their implementation in many Middle Eastern countries, India, and Russia. Enforcement and compliance with these standards vary widely from area to area. Many countries within these regions recently started to explore implementing ASTM or EN standards, with one major example being Saudi Arabia, which has seen huge growth in their amusement industry in recent years. Regardless, ISO standards remain an international baseline, but they also remain under-enforced in many areas where they're applied. The final area of the world to discuss is East Asia and Australia. Starting with Australia, they opted to create and enforce their own standard, with that standard being AS 3533. Their standard started independent of other standards, but has recently come into more alignment with ASTM and EN. That being said, there are still gaps in this standard that ASTM and EN cover, as well as strange exceptions that have caused rides to be non-compliant that would otherwise be compliant with the other standards. This has led to some strange situations, like the country essentially banning all yearly octopus, spider, and monster rides due to an accident in the past, despite these rides operating in other areas with reasonable modifications and doing so safely. Japan is in a very similar situation with their standards, such as JISA 1701. These standards suffer from the same problems as other local standards, being behind the international standards while also being overly strict in other areas. Thankfully, they have also moved towards implementing parts of ASTM and EN into their standards. One final major standard is the GB standard developed and maintained by the People's Republic of China. This standard has only seen adoption inside of China at this time. It suffers from some of the same shortfalls as other local standards. For example, it includes guidelines that require rides to be assigned a service life from their manufacturer that sets the amount of time that they are to be supported by them. After this time elapses, rides are required under the GB standard to undergo a risk assessment. The actual risk assessment process is very similar to the one required for new rides or major modifications under ASTM and EN. This involves a complete reinspection of the ride and requires the ride to be updated to be compliant with the latest version of the GB standard. It also requires an engineer to sign off on the ride and essentially take over as the manufacturer. In China, these individuals can be held personally responsible for the ride's safety, even if a future accident has nothing to do with their work. ASTM and EN, on the other hand, provide provisions for non-compliant rides to continue to operate as long as they have proven to be safe and are not majorly modified. Under the Western standards, there is no end date for these attractions. GB standards are written by a committee comprised of government officials as well as professionals within the industry. The expert involvement can be seen in some areas, as a few aspects of the GB standards do almost exactly mirror ASTM and EN. This is part of a broader industry effort over the last few years. While many aspects of ride standards vary from standard to standard, some things such as clearance envelopes and G-force limits have been harmonized across nearly all standards. This work continues, and it's hoped that in the future all standards are simply just mirrors of each other. Enforcement of GB standards can vary widely from province to province. On the park operator side, it's enforced very strictly at parks with large amusement rides, but smaller parks have found creative ways to make themselves exempt from following the standards. On the manufacturing side, larger manufacturers such as Jinma rides follow these standards very closely, but other manufacturers, like many based out of Henan province, have found a loophole in the regulations that has allowed them to produce very low quality and dangerous rides. Their rides are smaller, and so they simply classify them as other items like arcade games and plush toys, exempting them from the strict amusement ride standards. This, combined with undoubtedly a heavy dose of corruption, has allowed for an environment where large parks are strictly compliant with the stringent standards, while smaller operators and manufacturers operate and sell some of the most unsafe rides on the planet. I have made a separate video on both the GB standard and the existence of these rides if you'd like to learn more. There are of course other standards in place created by specific countries. As a general rule though, standards created by a locality are inferior at both protecting the public and helping operators run efficiently compared to the international ones. This is due to how specialized the amusement industry is. Attempting to apply standards from other industries to amusement rides usually just ends in an ugly mess of regulations that inconvenience operators and do not help to keep riders safe. Instead, requiring compliance with up-to-date international standards has the greatest impact on public safety. The growth and progress made by ASTM and EN over the last few years has made them more popular globally, and accordingly more and more areas are adopting parts or all of these standards. Safety is a collaborative process, and the communication from stakeholders all over the world has helped to shape these standards that we have discussed today. It is also this communication across standard writing organizations that has helped make so many of these standards redundant. The prevalence of these standards has made an impact on the global industry, as a clear set of guidelines is making it easier for manufacturers and operators to have a clear path to creating and operating safe rides, even if the standards are not legally required in their area. Amusement rides remain incredibly safe, far safer per rider than even air travel. This safety record is only poised to improve further as these global standards work their way into more areas and become required more and more. One final note, the ASTM standards are made by committees of people just like you watching this. Considering you have made it to the end of a video discussing amusement ride standards, you are clearly very interested in the amusement industry and the future of ride safety. Accordingly, you can attend these meetings and help shape the industry's future. I have left details on how to do this in the description. New voices are always welcome. Even if you don't work directly in the industry, you still likely have something to add. As always, thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.